In 1692, Salem was a small, isolated Puritan town resting in the cold silence of Massachusetts. The streets were narrow, the houses rough, the soil hard and unforgiving. People woke before dawn to pray, to work, to survive. Life was built upon faith and fear, each breath measured beneath the weight of heaven's gaze. They believed that every illness, every misfortune, every flicker of darkness in the mind was the work of something greater, something evil, watching from the shadows. The air in Salem carried a kind of tension that no one dared name aloud. It was a community bound by the scriptures, but fractured by envy and suspicion. Neighbors smiled in daylight and whispered in the dark. Children were raised to fear laughter that lingered too long, to avoid the warmth of music, to keep their eyes lowered and their souls clean. They were taught that the devil was not far away, that he walked unseen among them, waiting for a single moment of weakness. Among those who preached this fear was Reverend Samuel Parris, the town's minister. He was a man of conviction and anxiety, haunted by the thought that sin might be hiding in his own home. He had come to Salem to guide the faithful, yet his sermons split the congregation. Some believed him to be a servant of God. Others saw him as a man consumed by pride. Still, every Sunday, his voice thundered through the wooden meeting house, warning of damnation and the devil's deceit. In the winter of that year, his household became the center of something that would shake the world. His daughter, Betty Parris, and his niece, Abigail Williams, began to act strangely. They screamed in the night. They convulsed without cause. They spoke words that no one could understand. The town was frightened. It was said that the girls were bewitched. Physicians could find no reason for their suffering, and when human explanation failed, the people turned to the supernatural. Whispers began to rise through Salem like smoke. The devil had come. He had taken the children. He had found his servants among them. Who were they? Who had opened the door? In a place where belief was law, accusation became salvation. If one pointed a finger, one's own soul felt a little safer. The hunt for witches was not born of hatred alone. It was born of terror, of the desperate need to make sense of the unknown. 3 women were soon accused. Sarah Good, poor and often begging for bread. Sarah Osborne, who had defied the church by marrying against its will. And Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados who served Reverend Parris's household. They were easy targets, outsiders, women on the margins, people without power or protection. The girls claimed that these women had sent their spirits to torment them. Their words were taken as truth, for who would doubt the suffering of children? The trials began not in a court, but in a church, before neighbors and ministers. The women denied the charges, yet denial sounded like deceit. Each trembling voice, each stuttered prayer, was taken as proof. Fear had changed the meaning of truth. What mattered was not what could be proven, but what could be believed. The more the girls screamed, the more people listened. Their fits grew wilder, their stories darker. They said they saw specters hovering above the congregation, dark shapes that only they could see. Each time they named a new witch, the town gasped, as if air itself had turned to fire. No one was safe. The devil's reach, they said, was endless. Tituba, under questioning, finally confessed. Her words poured out in terror and confusion. She spoke of black dogs, of strange figures, of a tall man in a dark cloak who demanded her service. She said she had seen a book in which the devil made people sign their names. And when she said that others had signed too, the magistrates leaned forward. Who were they? How many more had pledged themselves to evil? Her confession became the spark that lit the blaze. Overnight, Salem changed. Friends avoided one another. Families turned inward. Women who had once shared food and gossip now crossed the street to avoid each other's eyes. Men watched their wives, their daughters, their servants, wondering if something unholy lived behind familiar faces. The village, so small and pious, had become a battlefield of invisible enemies. There were moments when the madness might have ended. Some tried to reason. Some whispered that the girls were lying or ill. But reason was powerless against fear. To question the trials was to invite suspicion. To defend the accused was to risk accusation. Silence became the only safety, and so silence ruled. In that silence, the list of names grew longer. Each accusation brought new dread. The accused were examined, their words twisted into guilt. The ministers fasted and prayed, convinced that God was testing their purity. And yet, beneath their devotion, there was something else. A hunger for certainty, a need to see evil punished, even if innocence had to burn with it. The people of Salem believed they were cleansing their town. In truth, they were destroying it. The fields went untended. The livestock starved. Children grew up learning that survival depended not on kindness, but on accusation. The church bells rang over a place that no longer felt holy, over a people who no longer trusted one another. As winter gave way to spring, the air in Salem grew thick with dread. The trials had not yet begun in full, but already the town had changed beyond recognition. What had once been a community of faith had become a congregation of fear. No one could tell where justice ended and vengeance began. In the years that followed, they would look back and wonder how it had happened. How neighbors became accusers, how faith became cruelty, how innocence became a crime. But in that moment, they were blind. They believed they were fighting evil. They believed they were saving their souls. They were wrong. The tremors of fear that had begun in Reverend Parris's parsonage now rippled outward across Salem, spreading faster than the cold wind across the snow-blanketed fields. One girl's scream became the town's alarm, and one accusation became the proof of all others. Parents watched their children with suspicion. Husbands watched their wives with dread, and the girls, those young, trembling girls, took on a terrifying authority that no one dared challenge. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams were no longer just children. They had become instruments of judgment, wielding an invisible power over an entire community, power granted not by God, but by the raw force of terror. Every corner of Salem seemed to whisper of the devil, a misplaced tool, a burnt loaf of bread, a sudden illness, or a shadow in the candlelight. Anything could be the work of witchcraft. And with the word bewitched hovering in the air, rational explanations vanished. The first arrests began with whispers in the night, and notes passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor. When the girls accused Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, the town collectively leaned in closer, listening as if each word might carry the voice of God itself. The magistrates, unsure yet desperate, convened to examine the claims. They had never faced anything like this, never imagined that children's words could hold such weight, and yet, in Salem, they did. Tituba, the enslaved woman, was the first to face interrogation. Her voice, trembling and hesitant at first, grew sharper as she spoke, for she had learned quickly that her words could control the course of the trial. She described visions of dark shapes, of fires that burned unseen, of a man in black who demanded allegiance. She named others, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of survival, and each name she spoke became a target, a possibility, a threat, and the townspeople, starved for certainty, swallowed every word. The magistrates nodded as though understanding, though confusion shadowed their faces. In Salem, confusion became guilt. Fear became law. It was not just the girls' accusations that fueled the hysteria. It was the way the community responded. Farmers halted their work in the fields, children abandoned play, and women shut themselves behind locked doors. Conversations that once centered on harvest and prayers now centered on who had spoken ill of whom, who had seen what, who might have consorted with spirits. Every stare, every twitch of the hand, every hesitation became proof of moral corruption. The world had turned inward upon itself, and every citizen became both judge and jury. Sarah Good, destitute and defenseless, denied any wrongdoing, but her words were drowned out by fear. Sarah Osborne, who had dared to challenge societal norms, faced the same fate. Tituba, caught between survival and confession, recounted visions so vivid and terrifying that even the skeptical began to tremble, and with each account, the number of accused began to swell. Soon, names were being written on paper faster than anyone could read them. Each accusation was a spark, and the town's fear-fed tinder blazed with it. The girls, meanwhile, escalated their performances. At times, they fell into violent convulsions, twisting their bodies and shrieking in voices that seemed not their own. They claimed to see black cats, shadows of women on the ceilings, and spectral fingers pointing at the guilty. Men and women, parents and neighbors, stared at them with mouths agape. Their authority became unquestionable, their power absolute. And in that moment, Salem itself seemed to lean toward madness. The first arrests were made in the dead of winter. Sarah Good was taken quietly from her home, Tituba from her master's household, Sarah Osborne from her bed, leaving neighbors to murmur prayers and threats alike. Chains clinked in the cold halls of the Salem jail, a sound that would come to signify not just punishment, but the ineffable weight of fear pressing upon every citizen. No one was immune. Even the pious who had once preached restraint now whispered of curses and evil marks. And as the jail cells filled, so too did the collective imagination of Salem. Every glance, every movement, every hesitation became proof that the devil had indeed taken root among them. Public interrogations began in earnest. Magistrates questioned the accused, pressing them to confess, to name others, to demonstrate their submission or guilt. The women, cornered and terrified, either confessed in desperation or clung to their innocence in defiance. Every confession, whether truthful or coerced, became another thread in the web of accusations. The girls pointed, the townsfolk nodded, and the machinery of hysteria churned forward. Accusation became ritual, and ritual became law. The community, gripped by the need for certainty, had begun to feed upon itself. Outside, the rhythm of daily life continued, but it was fractured and uneven. Fields went untilled, livestock went hungry, and neighbors avoided one another's gaze. Fear had become a language of its own, spoken not in words but in looks, gestures, and silence. Conversations that once carried warmth now carried judgment, suspicion, and dread. Even the youngest children learned to watch and mimic, to point, to whisper, to keep one eye on every adult. In Salem, innocence had become a currency as dangerous as guilt. As the trials continued, the town's sense of order began to unravel. No one knew whom to trust. No one knew where the devil might strike next. The girls, now emboldened by their authority, named women they disliked, neighbors who had slighted them, those who had been kind or cruel, indifferent or outspoken. Every accusation brought chaos. Families fractured. Friendships ended. The very fabric of Salem's social life began to tear under the weight of fear. Justice and vengeance had become indistinguishable, and the town's faith had been hijacked by terror. Even the magistrates themselves were not immune to the contagion. They listened to the girls' cries, watched their fits, and recorded their statements with solemn faces. Some tried to maintain skepticism, to reason, to separate truth from hysteria, but reason faltered under the weight of collective panic. When confronted with fear so raw, so palpable, even the most rational minds can bend. And in Salem, bending was not optional. To question the girls, to doubt the accusations, was to invite scrutiny, suspicion, and possibly accusation itself. In the homes and streets of Salem, shadows grew longer, not because of the sun, but because of the imagination, sharpened by fear. Every sound became suspect. Every cough, every misstep, every glance became evidence of collusion with the unseen. People began to interpret natural events as portents. A cow that died unexpectedly, a tree that split in a storm, a child who fell ill, each became proof of dark forces at work. And the more they believed, the more fear demanded new sacrifices, new names, new trials. By the time spring arrived, Salem had transformed into a town trapped in its own collective nightmare. Children held power no adult could question. Magistrates recorded confessions without proof. The accused lived in constant terror. And outside, the world carried on, unaware of the invisible war that had claimed an entire community from within. Salem was no longer a town. It was a mirror reflecting the human capacity for fear, suspicion, and cruelty when faith becomes distorted and power falls into the hands of those who cry loudest. The town had reached a tipping point. One accusation led to another. One confession led to another. And in every corner of Salem, people whispered the same question. Who would be next? And the answer, as the residents came to realize with a mixture of dread and resignation, was anyone. No one was safe. Fear had become the law, And in Salem, the devil had found a foothold, not in the bodies of women and men, but in the minds of all who had let terror rule their hearts. By the summer of 1692, Salem had become a town caught in the relentless grip of hysteria. What had started as the frightened whispers of a few children had grown into an unstoppable tide that consumed every street, every home, and every soul. The first court proceedings had begun, and the weight of judgment pressed down with an almost tangible force. In the wooden meeting house converted into a courthouse, magistrates sat at long tables, quills poised, eyes sharp, while the accused stood trembling, hands bound, hearts racing. The air was heavy, thick with the tension of expectation, fear, and the unspoken knowledge that each decision could mean life or death. The courtroom was no place for reason. The magistrates listened as the girls, now authorities of a supernatural law, described the spectral torments they had suffered. Their voices, sometimes trembling, sometimes commanding, narrated visions of invisible hands pressing against them, black shapes flying across walls, and nightmarish figures bending reality itself. The townsfolk watched with awe and terror. If the girls said a person had bewitched them, the testimony was accepted as absolute truth. There was no cross-examination that could override the fear in their hearts, no argument that could outweigh the collective panic. In Salem, terror had become proof, and accusation had become law. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were among the first to face trial. Sarah Good, ragged, hungry, and defenseless, trembled under the relentless gaze of her neighbors. She denied the charges, her voice faltering, trying to explain away what she could not understand herself. She spoke of being at home, tending to her daily tasks, praying to God, and avoiding sin. Yet the girl's testimony outweighed her words. Every quaver of her voice, every tear, every faltering gesture was interpreted as evidence of guilt. She was accused not merely of consorting with the devil, but of embodying evil itself. Sarah Osborne, older, outspoken, and accustomed to defying expectations, faced similar scrutiny. Her demeanor, calm and direct, was seen as defiance, as arrogance, as proof of alignment with dark forces. Each word she spoke was twisted, reinterpreted, and reframed. She had lived on the margins, yes, but she had lived boldly. In the fevered minds of Salem, boldness had become blasphemy, and boldness had a price. Tituba, the enslaved woman, confessed under the pressure of interrogation. Her confession was vivid, detailed, and terrifying. She spoke of meetings with dark figures, of pacts made in secret, of magic books, and the names of others who had pledged themselves to Satan. Every syllable she uttered sent waves through the congregation, waves of disbelief, fear, and exhilaration. The magistrates recorded each detail with solemn faces, as if transcribing divine revelations, and as each line of ink marked the paper, the shadow of execution grew longer over the town. The first hangings came swiftly. Bridget Bishop, a woman who had long defied norms and attracted gossip, was led to the gallows. She walked with dignity, though her heart must have trembled with the knowledge of what awaited. The townspeople lined the streets, silent and anxious, some praying, some curious, some relieved. The weight of collective judgment was almost ceremonial, as if the town itself were participating in a ritual to cleanse itself of an unseen evil. When the trapdoor released, Bridget Bishop fell, and the collective murmur rose in the crowd. Not cheers, not relief, but a palpable exhalation of terror, as though Salem had taken a breath in shared horror. One death did not end the fear. It validated it. The executions that followed were almost mechanical in their precision, yet chaotic in their emotional effect. Each hanging deepened paranoia. Each confession, voluntary or forced, added fuel to the fire. The names of the accused multiplied like shadows in the sunlight. Every neighbor wondered if their friend, their child, their spouse might be next. Every gesture of defiance or silence could be construed as collusion with evil. Trust became a liability. Observation became survival, and survival demanded participation in the hysteria. As the court sessions progressed, testimony became increasingly theatrical. The girls convulsed, fainted, and screamed, pointing at invisible enemies. Spectral evidence, the notion that a person's spirit could torment another without physical presence, was accepted as truth. Rationality was abandoned in favor of fear. The courts were no longer about justice. They were about affirming the belief that Salem's sins could only be punished through extreme measures. The walls of the meeting house echoed not with words, but with the reverberations of mass panic and collective guilt. Neighbors turned against neighbors with startling ease. Families fractured, alliances dissolved. Even the clergy, tasked with spiritual guidance, were swept up in the frenzy. Some sought to protect the innocent, but their voices were drowned by the dominant narrative of fear. Others fully embraced the opportunity to wield power over others under the guise of righteousness. The town had become a theater of accusation, a crucible in which morality, truth, and survival were molten and indistinguishable. Outside the courthouse, the streets reflected the inner chaos. Shops closed early, animals were left unattended, and the daily rhythm of life fractured under the pressure of uncertainty. Children, watching the adults around them, learned quickly that suspicion and accusation could confer power. They learned the language of fear. They learned to recognize the signs of guilt, real or imagined. In this environment, innocence was precarious, virtue suspect, and silence often the only defense. Reports of confessions and accusations traveled beyond Salem. Neighboring towns watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Letters carried tales of convulsions, specters, and public executions. Some dismissed them as exaggerations. Others feared that the devil's influence had spread further than Salem itself. The cultural impact of the trials began even before their conclusion, as the notion that fear could justify violence was witnessed by countless others who might never forget. In Salem, the hysteria became self-perpetuating. Fear demanded more fear. Accusations demanded more accusations. Confessions demanded more confessions. Each execution validated the logic of paranoia, and as the summer stretched on, the town found itself trapped in a cycle that it could neither stop nor fully understand. The devil, whether real or imagined, had taken hold not through magic, but through the human mind, its susceptibility, and the contagious nature of terror. The town's social fabric unraveled at a speed that was almost imperceptible at first. By the time the truth of some innocent lives being destroyed became apparent, it was too late. Trust, once a foundation of community, had been replaced by fear. Love and loyalty had been replaced by suspicion and self-preservation. And the lessons of the early accusations were clear. In Salem, accusation equaled proof, and proof equaled death. The machinery of persecution had no brakes, no pause, no mercy. As the first executions concluded and more trials loomed, the citizens of Salem began to internalize a new reality. Every gesture could be watched, every word could be misinterpreted, and every person, no matter how pious or pure, could be drawn into the vortex of fear. No one was truly safe, and no one would remain untouched by the hysteria. Salem had transformed from a simple Puritan settlement into a town governed entirely by terror, suspicion, and the unshakable belief that evil was always lurking just beyond sight, just beyond reason, just beyond control. By the late summer of 1692, Salem had become a town transformed almost beyond recognition. What had once been a small Puritan village, with its narrow streets, simple homes, and quiet devotion to God, had now become a theater of fear, accusation, and relentless suspicion. Each day brought news of new arrests. Every house held the possibility of judgment. Families, once unified by faith and daily toil, began to splinter under the weight of fear. The invisible presence of the devil, believed to haunt every shadow, had made every neighbor a potential enemy and every friend a potential betrayer. The courthouse, once a place of reason and governance, had become a stage for hysteria. Magistrates listened to the girls as they described increasingly elaborate visions of torment. They recounted figures that moved through walls, fingers that reached from the air to pinch, scratch, and harm them, and dark, whispering shadows that promised eternal damnation to those who opposed them. The people of Salem, terrified and desperate for certainty, accepted these visions as incontrovertible truth. Any defense or rational explanation offered by the accused was drowned out by the force of collective fear. In Salem, the court did not seek the truth. It sought the validation of terror. Mass arrests swept through the town, touching every corner, every household. Men and women, young and old, were seized in the middle of the night. Children watched as parents were dragged away, bound in chains, their faces pale with fear, their voices pleading for mercy. Husbands looked on as wives were accused of consorting with evil. Mothers whispered frantic prayers over children, fearing that the smallest misstep might be interpreted as complicity with the devil. And everywhere, the girl's words carried weight unmatched by reason or fact. A pointing finger could decide fate. A trembling voice could sentence a neighbor to prison or death. The first wave of mass arrests targeted those already marginalized. Beggars, widows, servants, and outspoken women were accused, and the town seemed almost relieved to direct its fear outward toward those with little power. Yet as the hysteria deepened, the net widened. Prosperous citizens, respected elders, and even members of the clergy were not immune. The logic of fear demanded that if anyone could wield evil, anyone could be guilty. No reputation, no status, no virtue could shield a person from suspicion. The invisible hand of terror reached into every home, every family, and every conscience. Families began to fracture under the pressure. Fathers, forced to choose between defending their wives or protecting their children, struggled with impossible decisions. Mothers, trying to shield their children from fear, found themselves accused simply for standing between the girls and the accused. Siblings were torn apart as one's actions, or even mere words, were misinterpreted as alignment with evil. Friendships dissolved under suspicion. A neighbor's kindness could be twisted into a sign of guilt. The entire social fabric of Salem, once held together by shared faith and community, unraveled almost overnight. The accused, once isolated individuals, now faced the full machinery of social, religious, and legal condemnation. Prison cells overflowed, their wooden walls cramped with bodies and despair. Those imprisoned were subjected to harsh conditions: cold, hunger, disease, and the constant terror of an uncertain fate. Each day in confinement was a trial in itself, stripping the accused of dignity, hope, and often reason. Confessions were demanded not merely as testimony, but as a lifeline. To confess, true or false, was to secure temporary reprieve. To deny could mean immediate execution. Under such pressure, the boundaries between truth and fiction, guilt and innocence, became nearly meaningless. The courtroom spectacles grew increasingly grotesque. The girls' performances intensified. They writhed, screamed, and convulsed, describing invisible attacks with a conviction that convinced magistrates and townspeople alike. Every gesture, every flinch, every stammered word became evidence of dark alignment. Spectral evidence, previously dismissed in theory, now dominated the proceedings. The magistrates, caught between belief, fear, and their own desire for divine justification, allowed the spectral testimonies to dictate judgment. Justice was no longer a process. It was a confirmation of terror. As more people were accused, the psychological pressure on Salem intensified. Children internalized the lessons of accusation, learning to point, to whisper, and to assert themselves in a world where fear conferred authority. Mothers feared their children's words. Fathers feared their wives' associations. Every interaction became a potential liability, every conversation a possible trap. The town became a labyrinth of suspicion in which one misstep could mean a life lost, a family broken, a community destabilized. The hysteria was self-perpetuating. Fear bred fear, accusation bred accusation, and the machinery of persecution churned with relentless efficiency. Even the clergy, supposed pillars of reason and morality, were ensnared. Some questioned the methods of accusation, the validity of spectral evidence, the morality of punishing the innocent. Yet dissent was perilous. To doubt was to draw attention. To suggest restraint was to risk being labeled sympathetic to evil. In this environment, neutrality became impossible, and morality was tested in cruel, relentless ways. The minister's own faith was warped by the flood of fear. as their desire to protect their congregation collided with the reality that their congregation now feared each other more than sin itself. The hysteria spilled beyond Salem, affecting neighboring towns and communities. Letters and messages carried accounts of strange fits, confessions, and public executions. People who had once viewed Salem as a remote village began to see it as a cautionary tale, a mirror of what unchecked fear and superstition could do to a society. The influence of the trials extended far beyond the town limits, leaving a legacy of caution, horror, and reflection that would be felt for generations. Within Salem, daily life became a fragmented shadow of what it had been. Markets emptied early, barns were left untended, and the normal rhythm of work and worship was disrupted. Fear dominated every interaction. People spoke cautiously, moved cautiously, and even looked cautiously. To act with normalcy became an act of courage, and yet courage itself was suspect. In this new reality, the smallest actions could carry consequences far beyond intention. By autumn, the town had changed in ways that were irreversible. The initial spark of accusation had grown into a consuming fire, devouring trust, relationships, and reason. Families remained intact only in appearance, their hearts hardened by the knowledge that even those closest to them could become agents of fear. Children learned to survive by observing, imitating, and participating in the cycle of hysteria. Adults learned that silence might be the only safeguard. The town, once united by faith and community, now existed in a delicate, trembling balance of fear and suspicion. The executions continued. Each one, carried out with the same procedural efficiency, amplified the town's collective dread. Spectators, once horrified, grew accustomed to the sight of hanging, the snap of the rope, the finality of death. And yet each execution also fueled the need for more, for confirmation that the devil's agents were indeed among them. Confession, accusation, and execution had become an intertwined, unbreakable rhythm, guiding the lives of every inhabitant. In Salem, fear was not merely a sentiment. It was the law, the moral code, and the pulse of daily existence. As the leaves turned and the chill of fall crept into the town, Salem had become a place where innocence could no longer be assumed, where virtue could be punished, and where reason was powerless against the contagion of terror. Every action, every glance, every word was filtered through the lens of suspicion. Every citizen understood implicitly that survival depended not on truth, justice, or even piety, but on the ability to navigate the treacherous currents of fear and accusation that now defined the town. Salem, the town that had once existed quietly under the strict but predictable laws of Puritan faith, had been transformed into a living nightmare. Fear had become tangible, a force more real than any physical threat. Suspicion had become a form of governance, and in every home, in every street, in every heart, the invisible weight of terror pressed relentlessly, shaping behavior, dictating speech, and determining the fate of all who remained within its grip. The town had been consumed from within, devoured by the very human impulses of fear, envy, and the desperate need for control. And the haunting truth was that this horror had not ended. It had only begun, destined to echo through history, teaching lessons of human nature that remain relevant centuries later. By the late autumn of 1692, Salem had become a town unrecognizable even to those who had lived there their entire lives. Streets that had once echoed with the simple rhythms of daily labor now carried the weight of suspicion, accusation, and grief. The rhythm of the seasons mattered little. The rhythm of fear ruled all. In every household, in every meeting house, and along every road, there was a quiet, pervasive terror that had replaced faith, hope, and reason. The town's very soul had been transformed into a vessel of panic and despair, and no one remained untouched. The first executions had set a precedent that would ripple through every action and thought in Salem. Bridget Bishop, the first to die, had fallen not as an individual, but as a symbol. Her death validated the girl's claims, reinforced the magistrate's authority, and confirmed the town's worst suspicions. Each hanging thereafter served the same purpose: to terrify, to punish, to teach the community that the devil was real, that evil lurked close, and that inaction or dissent could invite destruction. The macabre spectacle became a collective ritual, performed in public with the grim satisfaction that the devil was being purged, one life at a time. By now, dozens had been accused. Men and women, young and old, were arrested on the flimsiest of claims. Spectral evidence, visions of spirits tormenting the girls, dominated the court proceedings. Every twitch, convulsion, or scream was interpreted as confirmation of guilt. Magistrates themselves, uncertain yet bound by fear and religious duty, accepted the girls' testimonies without question. The concept of proof had become entirely secondary to the persuasive power of terror. Fear had supplanted justice, suspicion had replaced reason, and the machinery of persecution continued to churn without pause. Families were torn apart with a merciless efficiency. Fathers were imprisoned alongside their wives. Mothers watched helplessly as their children were accused. Brothers turned against sisters. Neighbors, once supportive, now pointed and whispered. Every home, every hearth, every relationship was at risk. The unthinkable became ordinary. Children learned to point at neighbors with confidence, knowing that their word might determine life or death. Spouses watched each other with suspicion, measuring every glance, every gesture. Survival required constant vigilance and participation in the cycle of accusation. In Salem, innocence was a liability, and compliance with hysteria was a necessity. Public trials had become theatrical performances. The girls' acts grew more elaborate as the weeks passed. They fell into convulsions, rolled on the floor, screamed, and described ever more intricate attacks by unseen forces. Shadows stretched across walls and ceilings in their visions. Invisible hands reached out to touch, pinch, and harm them. Magistrates, desperate for evidence, relied entirely on these spectral claims. In the minds of Salem's leaders, the devil's presence had been proven. Denial, argument, or demonstration of innocence was useless. The accused were condemned not by facts, but by imagination, fear, and the persuasive power of performance. The arrests continued with relentless momentum. Servants, widows, beggars, outspoken women, respected citizens, and even some of the clergy were drawn into the vortex of suspicion. No one was safe. The logic was simple and merciless. If the devil could act through the innocent, then everyone was potentially compromised. And so, names multiplied, prisons overflowed, and the emotional strain on the community grew unbearable. Salem had entered a cycle from which there seemed no exit. Accusation, imprisonment, fear, despair, and the demand for more accusations. The toll on human life escalated rapidly. Each hanging was both punishment and instruction, a public demonstration of the consequences of defiance or guilt. People watched in silence, some in horror, some in grim fascination. The line between observation and complicity blurred. Those who remained free lived under constant dread, understanding that the next person named could be a friend, a sibling, a spouse, or even themselves. Each execution confirmed the girl's authority, reinforced the court's power, and deepened the town's collective nightmare. Meanwhile, inside the prison walls, the conditions were harsh beyond imagination. Cold, hunger, disease, and psychological torment took their toll. The accused were forced into small, overcrowded spaces, chained and denied basic comforts. Confessions, whether true or false, became a currency for survival. To confess was to delay death. To deny was to court it immediately. Under these extreme pressures, some confessed to crimes they did not commit, while others held on to innocence until the end, knowing that courage offered no guarantee. The distinction between truth and fiction, guilt and innocence, had vanished entirely. By mid-autumn, the strain on the townspeople began to show subtle cracks. Some started to question the logic of the trials, though fear prevented them from speaking aloud. Parents grieved in secret for children imprisoned or condemned. Friends mourned in silence, fearing that mourning itself could be construed as sympathy for witches. Even the magistrates, previously unwavering, began to feel the weight of doubt pressing against them. How many innocent lives had been destroyed? How many accusations were fueled by envy, malice, or desperation? Could justice and fear ever coexist? Such thoughts, however quietly entertained, were dangerous. To voice them was to risk becoming part of the machinery one had begun to doubt. The hysteria continued its relentless pace. Each day brought new accusations, new arrests, and new confessions. Families were broken beyond repair. Parents, siblings, neighbors, and children all became entwined in the ever-expanding web of suspicion. The town, once bound together by faith and community, now functioned as a network of observers, accusers, and terrified participants. Life itself was measured not by morality, piety, or reason, but by the ability to navigate the perilous currents of suspicion and survival. The public executions, meanwhile, continued to enforce the town's terrifying moral order. Spectators grew accustomed to the sight of hanging, yet the horror remained, a constant, oppressive presence. The community internalized the lessons. Fear justified cruelty. Accusation validated action. Survival demanded participation in terror. Each hanging, each trial, each confession reinforced the unbreakable logic of paranoia, binding every inhabitant to the cycle. Salem's streets, homes, and hearts had been transformed into a stage where every action, thought, and word could serve as evidence of complicity with evil. By late autumn, the first stirrings of remorse and doubt began to appear. Some townspeople, witnessing the destruction of innocent lives, began to question the righteousness of their actions. But even as doubt took root in hearts, it could not yet manifest in action. The machinery of fear was too well oiled, the authority of the girls too absolute, and the precedent of death too firmly established. The tension between conscience and survival created a silent torment in many, a gnawing fear that what had been done could never be undone. Salem, by this point, existed in a terrifying equilibrium. The devil, whether real or imagined, had been allowed to infiltrate every thought, every action, every relationship. The town's social, spiritual, and moral structures had collapsed beneath the weight of hysteria. Families had been fractured, friendships destroyed, and the innocent condemned. The machinery of persecution had become a force of nature, unstoppable, consuming, and indiscriminate. And yet, even amidst this darkness, the first seeds of reflection and regret began to take root. Some whispered doubts, some prayed for forgiveness. Some looked upon the dead and felt a hollow, unshakable sorrow. In these quiet moments, the town began to glimpse the human cost of fear unchecked by reason, the tragic consequences of allowing terror to dictate justice, and the fragile, tragic nature of trust. As autumn deepened and the days shortened, Salem seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight, not merely the absence of sunlight, but a darkness born from fear, suspicion, and grief. The town had grown accustomed to the machinery of accusation. Arrests, trials, confessions, and executions had become the new rhythm of life. Streets were quieter, not for lack of activity, but because silence had become safer than speech. Children no longer played freely. Their eyes, trained to watch, scanned every adult, every neighbor, every visitor for signs of guilt. Parents, whose hearts ached with the knowledge that their children could be the next instruments of accusation, held them closer, yet more guardedly than ever. Every action, every gesture carried the potential to condemn or save, and the weight of this understanding pressed relentlessly on every resident of Salem. In the courthouse, the magistrates, once confident in their moral authority, now moved with an awareness of the precarious balance they maintained between order and chaos. Each trial was a performance of judgment, yet beneath the outward show of control, uncertainty gnawed at their conscience. They had presided over the execution of Bridget Bishop and many others, had validated accusations based on spectral evidence, and had witnessed the collapse of logic beneath the collective force of fear. And now, with the number of accused rising daily, the burden of responsibility had become almost unbearable. Every name added to the list carried with it the potential for irreparable tragedy. Every decision, each ruling, had consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom, touching families, neighbors, and the very moral fabric of the town itself. The final executions were approaching, each one a grim punctuation mark in the story of Salem's descent. Those condemned, men and women, young and old, were escorted to the gallows with trembling dignity. Their faces, etched with fear, resignation, or defiance, reflected the complexity of human emotion in the shadow of imminent death. Spectators gathered in hushed crowds, the air thick with anticipation, sorrow, and the faint, unspoken thrill of witnessing the extraordinary. The executions were public spectacles in which fear, morality, and the need for communal validation intertwined, creating an atmosphere in which the distinction between justice and cruelty had long since disappeared. Inside the courtroom, the girls, once small, trembling children, had become powerful arbiters of fate. Their convulsions, cries, and accusations now commanded unquestioned authority. They pointed at the accused with the certainty of divine judgment, and the townspeople, conditioned by weeks of fear and repeated validation, accepted their words without hesitation. Each gesture, each scream, each described vision of specters tormenting them reinforced the perception of guilt. Rational debate, evidence, or defense had been rendered nearly meaningless. The court was no longer a place of reason, but a stage where terror dictated every action. Yet, amidst the escalating hysteria, seeds of doubt began to stir. Some townspeople, hardened by the repeated spectacle of accusations and executions, began to question the validity of what they had accepted without hesitation. Quiet whispers emerged in the shadows of homes and along dimly lit streets. Neighbors who had once nodded along to the accusations now hesitated, their thoughts turning inward as they contemplated the possibility that innocence had been destroyed in the name of fear. Clergy members, who had once exhorted the faithful to believe in the veracity of the girls' visions, began to wrestle with conscience and morality. Had they allowed themselves to be instruments of injustice? Could they undo the damage already inflicted? These questions were perilous. To speak them aloud could invite suspicion or accusation. And yet, the internal conflict gnawed at the hearts and minds of those who dared to consider them. Parents mourned privately for children imprisoned or executed. Friends grieved for one another. The cumulative weight of guilt began to erode the unquestioning faith that had allowed hysteria to flourish. The machinery of fear was still active, still deadly, but cracks were beginning to show in its once impenetrable facade. Prison conditions, meanwhile, remained harsh. The accused were confined in crowded, cold, and unsanitary cells. Disease and malnutrition compounded the psychological strain. Families and friends who could once visit and support prisoners were wary, fearful that even association might attract accusation. Confessions, true or coerced, were still demanded, though the stark knowledge of past injustices created tension among the magistrates themselves. Some sought to extract truth, others realized that the extraction itself had become a method of perpetuating terror. Executions continued, though now, for some observers, the ritual had begun to lose its absolute power over the collective psyche. The sight of the gallows, the rope, and the finality of death still horrified many, but the sense of inevitability that had dominated early trials was starting to fracture. Questions whispered behind closed doors, doubt shared between trusted neighbors, and private grief became the first, tentative challenges to the culture of fear. Some who had once demanded the death of their fellow townspeople now hesitated, their hearts conflicted and their minds unsettled. As autumn bled into winter, the town of Salem began to feel the first faint pressures of reflection. Parents, survivors, and even some magistrates began to weigh the consequences of their actions. The initial justification, ridding the town of evil, was now seen in a more complicated light. Could innocence be distinguished from guilt after so many weeks of accusation? Had the town been punishing the devil, or had it been punishing itself, using the guise of divine justice to channel envy, fear, and personal vendettas? These were dangerous questions, but they were being asked quietly and increasingly frequently. In this climate of growing unease, some accused were released, though not without lingering suspicion. Each release was a delicate act, requiring careful management of public perception, reassurance of the community, and a measured display of moral authority. The freed walked cautiously among their neighbors, aware that while legal danger might have passed, social suspicion remained. Families attempted to reunite, though the scars of separation and fear were deep. The social fabric of Salem had been stretched to near breaking, and the slow process of stitching it back together had only just begun. At the same time, the girls' power began to wane. Their authority, once absolute, faced subtle challenges. Older townspeople, clergy, and magistrates began to speak in measured tones, to question the validity of spectral evidence, and to suggest that innocence might have been condemned in error. The hysteria was not over, but its momentum was slowing. Fear still dominated daily life, but the town had glimpsed the possibility of reason, reflection, and justice tempered by conscience. Salem's collective consciousness began to shift. The horrors of the past months, executions, broken families, public trials dominated by spectral evidence, left indelible marks on every survivor. Grief, guilt, and remorse became part of the social atmosphere. The town had learned that terror could govern, but it had also begun to see that terror could destroy. The machinery of hysteria was not easily dismantled, but the first cracks, fissures of conscience and doubt were forming. And as winter's chill set in, Salem braced itself, not for the next accusation, but for the reckoning of its own soul. By the end of Scene 6, Salem was poised between two realities: the continuation of fear-driven persecution and the emerging awareness of human error, injustice, and the consequences of allowing hysteria to dominate reason. The town, still scarred, still grieving, still trapped in cycles of suspicion, began its slow, painful journey toward acknowledgement of wrongdoing, tentative forgiveness, and the first steps of moral restoration. Winter had fully descended upon Salem, blanketing the streets and fields in an unforgiving layer of snow that mirrored the town's frozen tension. The rhythm of life had changed completely. No longer dictated solely by work or worship, it was now governed by vigilance, suspicion, and the quiet, persistent weight of conscience. The hysteria that had gripped Salem at its peak was still present, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift had begun. Fear remained, but doubt was creeping in alongside it, growing in strength as residents quietly observed the unfolding consequences of months of unchecked accusation and execution. It started with whispers, hesitant, half-formed doubts shared in the privacy of one's home, murmured only to the most trusted family member or friend. Could it be that we were wrong? Someone might ask, voice trembling, heart racing. Did we condemn the innocent while thinking we obeyed God? These whispers were dangerous. To voice them publicly could still invite suspicion, accusation, or even imprisonment. And yet, they were spreading, quietly but inexorably, as the townspeople began to compare notes, recount stories, and reflect on the faces and lives of those already executed or imprisoned. Parents who had once taught their children to fear witches were now wrestling with the knowledge that perhaps their own obedience had contributed to the destruction of innocent lives. Husbands and wives confronted one another in private about the actions they had taken, the accusations they had encouraged, and the guilt they now carried. Even those who had once been most fervent in their support of the trials began to reconsider the certainty with which they had acted, questioning not only the events themselves, but their own role in perpetuating them. At the center of this shift in perception were the girls whose testimonies had once dictated life and death across the town. Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and their companions had grown confident and commanding. But as doubt took hold among the townspeople, their absolute authority began to be challenged, first quietly, then with increasing boldness. Parents of other children began to question the legitimacy of the girls' visions, pointing out inconsistencies in their stories, noting exaggerations, and highlighting contradictions in their dramatic performances. Clergy members and magistrates, who had relied so heavily on these testimonies to justify convictions, started to voice concerns privately, debating whether the evidence they had once unquestioningly accepted truly reflected reality or merely the fevered imaginations of young girls exploiting fear. Public meetings, once dominated entirely by support for the trials and the girls' claims, began to shift subtly. Small groups of townspeople convened in whispered assemblies, discussing the mounting inconsistencies in accusations and testimonies. Some dared to suggest that the girls themselves might be motivated by personal grievances, jealousy, or the desire for attention, rather than by divine visions or direct demonic influence. These conversations, tentative at first, slowly gained traction as more people realized that the cycle of accusation and execution had left families devastated, friendships destroyed, and the town's moral fabric torn. A collective unease began to grow, fueled by the awareness that the past month's hysteria had not purged evil, but rather revealed the depth of human susceptibility to fear and manipulation. The first direct challenges to the girls' authority emerged during court sessions. Families of the accused, previously silenced by fear, began to question the validity of spectral evidence, to demand corroborating witnesses, and to point out contradictions in the girls' accounts. Magistrates, who had for so long accepted these testimonies without question, were forced to listen, weighing the public's increasing skepticism against their desire to maintain social order. The courtroom, once a place of unquestioned acceptance of hysteria, became a battleground where reason and fear confronted one another, however imperfectly. While fear still held sway, the very presence of challenge introduced a new dynamic that could not be ignored. At the same time, the social consequences of prior accusations and executions added weight to the emerging skepticism. Neighbors who had supported the trials now grieved the loss of friends, relatives, and colleagues. Families fractured, businesses suffered, and the town's economy, already strained by fear-driven disruption, began to show signs of real distress. The human cost of the hysteria was undeniable, visible in every tear-streaked face, every empty household, and every whispered lament. As people reflected on the devastation, the simple logic that had driven the trials, fear-justified action, began to falter. The townspeople recognized that fear alone could not serve as a reliable guide for justice, and the first inklings of moral reckoning emerged. In homes across Salem, conversations shifted from planning daily survival to examining the events of the past months. Mothers recounted stories of children imprisoned or condemned. Fathers lamented decisions that had endangered their families, and older townspeople reflected on how easily their own faith had been manipulated. The town's spiritual leaders, who had once commanded unwavering obedience, found themselves grappling with ethical dilemmas, questioning whether adherence to hysteria had truly served God or merely human impulses of fear, envy, and control. Sermons began to emphasize caution, discernment, and the dangers of acting without sufficient evidence, signaling a subtle but significant shift in the community's collective mindset. Amid this growing skepticism, the girls themselves exhibited signs of strain. Their confidence, once absolute, wavered in response to the quiet but mounting challenges to their authority. Some began to hesitate in their performances, their convulsions and screams less convincing, their accusations more cautious. Others continued with vigor, but the public's reception had changed. Where once every word had been received as truth, it was now met with subtle skepticism, raised eyebrows, and pointed questions. The dynamic that had allowed them to dictate fate with impunity was beginning to erode, revealing the fragility of power based solely on fear and the perception of divine authority. The broader community began to act cautiously, testing the boundaries of this new reality. Families once silenced by terror now attended court sessions with an air of quiet determination, observing, listening, and mentally cataloging inconsistencies. Neighborhood meetings, initially clandestine, grew bolder as residents shared experiences, compared accusations, and debated the veracity of claims. Even those who had previously enforced the hysteria began to reconsider their positions, recognizing that complicity had come at an immense moral and social cost. The town's equilibrium, long held in thrall to fear, was slowly tilting toward reflection, doubt, and the pursuit of justice, tempered by conscience. This growing skepticism had practical consequences in the courtroom as well. Judges and magistrates began to require more concrete evidence, questioning the reliance on spectral testimonies alone. Accusations were scrutinized with increasing rigor, and some previously accepted confessions were re-evaluated. The process was uneven, chaotic, and fraught with tension, but it marked the beginning of a slow retreat from the hysteria that had consumed Salem. While fear remained a powerful force, it no longer held unchallenged dominion over the town. Reason, morality, and doubt had begun their return, carving a fragile path through the devastation wrought by months of terror. By the end of Scene 7, Salem was caught between two worlds, the lingering shadow of fear, accusation and execution, and the emerging light of skepticism, reflection, and moral awakening. The girl's authority was no longer absolute. The townspeople were learning to question, to observe critically, and to resist the seduction of hysteria. Families, while still wounded, began to cautiously reconstruct trust. The courtroom, once a theater of terror, became a space where challenge was possible, and the very fabric of Salem's society, riven by fear, began tentatively to sew itself back together. Winter's grip had tightened on Salem, covering the town in a blanket of frost and silence that mirrored the heavy weight settling on its people. The streets, once crowded with the frantic steps of those fleeing accusation or reporting another neighbor, were now quieter, subdued by exhaustion, reflection, and the creeping shadow of conscience. Families that had once been torn apart cautiously reunited, their reunions tinged with grief, shame, and the unspoken recognition of what had been lost. The machinery of fear that had dominated the town for months was no longer as omnipotent. Doubt, reflection, and a growing sense of moral responsibility began to permeate homes, meeting houses, and courthouses alike. The first seeds of social repair, fragile though they were, had taken root. The release of the accused began cautiously, and it was a complex, almost ritualized process. Each prisoner freed required careful planning, both to protect them from renewed suspicion and to manage public perception. Families were reunited in private ceremonies that were often quiet, somber affairs. Mothers embraced children who had spent weeks imprisoned, their tears unrestrained, their voices choked with relief and sorrow. Fathers helped restore household routines disrupted by months of fear and absence. Yet joy was muted by the knowledge that many would never return, that some faces were gone forever, and that the town itself had been forever altered by its own participation in the hysteria. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Those released from prison carried the burden of trauma, humiliation, and grief, often compounded by the community's continued, subtle suspicion. Children, once innocent witnesses to the power of accusation, had grown wary, calculating, and at times wary of their own parents. Parents struggled to reconcile their roles in both protecting and inadvertently participating in the machinery of fear. Relationships were forever changed. Trust, once a cornerstone of Salem society, had been strained to its breaking point. The town's social networks, which had relied on mutual support, shared labor, and common faith, required careful reconstruction. Every gesture of reconciliation, every attempt at restoration, carried the silent weight of past horrors. Public remorse began to emerge as a defining feature of this period. Town meetings, previously dominated by the fervor of accusation and validation of the girls' testimonies, now became forums for reflection, apology, and debate. Clergy delivered sermons emphasizing mercy, reason, and the dangers of unchecked fear. Some townspeople stood publicly to confess their roles in perpetuating false accusations or supporting unjust executions. Tears, sobs, and expressions of regret marked these gatherings as survivors acknowledged the mistakes of their community. Each public act of remorse served not merely to absolve individual conscience, but to signal a collective attempt to rebuild moral order and social cohesion. Alongside this process of public acknowledgement, practical efforts to restore the town's stability began. Farms that had been neglected were tended once more. Trade, commerce, and communal labor gradually resumed, though always under the shadow of recent events. Children returned to school, though lessons now carried deeper significance. The dangers of fear, the necessity of questioning authority, and the moral responsibility that accompanies community life. Families reestablished routines, yet these routines were now tempered by heightened awareness and caution. The rebuilding was slow, painstaking, and fraught with tension, but it was driven by the shared understanding that Salem could not return to the state it had Known before the hysteria, the psychological aftermath extended beyond individual households to the town's civic and religious institutions. Magistrates, clergy, and other authorities engaged in intense self-reflection. Those who had presided over trials, sanctioned arrests, or validated spectral evidence were forced to confront the human consequences of their decisions. Some experienced profound guilt, despair, and a sense of moral failure, recognizing that their adherence to fear had directly contributed to the suffering of neighbors, friends, and even children. Others struggled to balance repentance with the necessity of maintaining authority, wary that public acknowledgement of error could destabilize the fragile social order further. The complexity of these dilemmas underscored the deep and lasting impact of the trials on Salem's civic and spiritual leadership. Families attempted to navigate a complicated moral and social landscape. Parents who had inadvertently contributed to accusations faced both internal and external scrutiny. Children, many of whom had witnessed or participated in the hysteria, had to learn to reconcile their actions with a new understanding of right and wrong. Relationships were often strained as past mistakes came to light. Forgiveness, both sought and offered, became a crucial but difficult component of healing. Townspeople understood, often silently, that the path forward required acknowledging the wrongs of the past while striving to prevent similar errors in the future. In the midst of rebuilding, memories of the executed and wrongfully imprisoned continued to haunt the collective consciousness. Gravestones, memorials, and empty homes served as reminders of the cost of fear unchecked by reason. Conversations in homes and public spaces frequently circled back to these memories, reinforcing a sense of caution, humility, and moral responsibility. The town's leaders encouraged remembrance and reflection, seeking to prevent history from repeating itself. Even children learned the stories, often in hushed tones, of those who had suffered, instilling an early awareness of the dangers of hysteria, superstition, and the power of accusation. By the spring following the winter of reflection, the town had made measurable progress. Life in Salem resumed, though it was irrevocably changed. Markets reopened fully, churches regained congregations, and children played more freely, though under the cautious watch of parents wary of past chaos. Social and civic norms were reestablished, grounded in a new consciousness of justice, mercy, and the limits of human judgment. The town collectively acknowledged that fear had been a powerful and dangerous force, capable of overriding reason, morality, and compassion. Lessons, painful though they were, had been learned, and they were etched into the collective memory of the community. At the conclusion of Scene 8, Salem exists at a fragile equilibrium. The town has begun the slow, careful process of reconciliation and restoration, both socially and morally. The release of prisoners, public expressions of remorse, and efforts to rebuild community trust mark the first steps toward recovery. Yet the scars of hysteria remain, in empty chairs at family tables, in gravestones marking unjust executions, and in the wary eyes of children who had witnessed the destructive power of fear. Salem has survived, but the lessons of human vulnerability, susceptibility to panic, and the consequences of unchecked suspicion linger, shaping its future in profound and lasting ways. With spring fully arrived, the snow of winter had melted from Salem's streets, leaving behind muddy paths and the occasional patch of frozen earth. Yet the town itself remained in a state of tentative recovery, its external appearance belying the lingering psychological scars that the trials had inflicted on every resident. The streets were quieter than they had ever been during the hysteria, but the hush was not merely peaceful. It was heavy with reflection, regret, and a new, cautious vigilance. Families, once torn apart by arrests and executions, attempted to restore routines. Yet each gathering, meal, and conversation carried the subtle weight of the town's collective memory. Life had resumed, but it was no longer the simple, unquestioning existence that had characterized Salem before the hysteria. Now every act of trust, every word spoken, and every glance exchanged was layered with awareness, the invisible residue of fear and trauma still permeating daily life. The public arena, where once accusations had echoed and spectral evidence ruled unquestioned, had shifted to one of moral reckoning and reflection. Courts reopened, but the tone had changed dramatically. Magistrates were now cautious, aware that every verdict carried the weight of past errors. The reliance on spectral evidence had been largely abandoned, replaced with calls for more tangible, verifiable proof, and a focus on fairness tempered by the painful lessons of the prior months. Families of the wrongfully accused and executed were now able to speak, to plead for recognition, restitution, and acknowledgement of the wrongs inflicted upon them. These proceedings, while far from simple or devoid of tension, represented a significant shift in Salem's approach to justice, one guided not solely by fear, but by reason, conscience, and emerging collective remorse. Remorse was not confined to formal institutions. In homes across the town, parents, siblings, and friends confronted their own actions and inactions during the hysteria. Mothers who had once encouraged or validated accusations wrestled with guilt over the suffering inflicted upon neighbors or acquaintances. Fathers who had failed to protect family members from arrest struggled with the moral weight of their perceived cowardice or misjudgment. Even children who had been manipulated, coerced, or taught to participate in the accusatory culture experienced a complicated mix of shame, fear, and understanding as they began to grasp the enormity of what had occurred. The process of reflection was pervasive, reaching into every corner of Salem's domestic and social life, reminding all that no action, no matter how small or indirect, had been free of consequence. Community leaders, clergy, and magistrates engaged in intense deliberations about the moral and spiritual consequences of the trials. Sermons emphasized humility, the dangers of presumption, and the necessity of tempering fear with reason. In some cases, leaders offered public apologies, acknowledging errors in judgment and expressing sorrow for the harm done. These gestures, though insufficient to erase the pain, played a crucial role in the town's tentative moral reconstruction, signaling that even those in positions of authority recognized the human cost of unchecked fear and the dangers of granting absolute authority to children or hysteria-driven testimony. Public repentance became a key element in reestablishing social trust and collective conscience. Even as wounds remained fresh and many individuals continued to bear private grief, social rebuilding proceeded cautiously but steadily. Markets, which had been disrupted by months of fear and avoidance, reopened and gradually regained activity. Neighbors who had once avoided one another now engaged in carefully monitored interactions, testing the waters of renewed trust. Children returned to schools with an awareness of their previous participation in the hysteria, their education now carrying a moral and historical dimension that included reflection on the dangers of fear, envy, and unchecked authority. Families undertook the delicate work of repairing relationships strained or broken by months of paranoia. And community rituals, religious observances, communal work, and public gatherings began to regain their former place, albeit now infused with the caution born of experience. One of the most profound aspects of Salem's recovery involved the reconciliation of memory and mourning. Graves of the executed became sites of both sorrow and reflection. Families created informal memorials, recounting the lives and virtues of those who had been lost. Neighbors shared stories of the innocent, of the small kindnesses that had persisted amidst terror, and of moments of courage that had gone unnoticed during the height of hysteria. These acts of remembrance served multiple purposes: honoring the dead, acknowledging injustice, and reinforcing the moral lessons that had been painfully learned. By keeping the memory of the victims alive, Salem sought to instill a collective conscience capable of resisting the seductions of fear, prejudice, and collective panic in the future. The townspeople also faced the ongoing challenge of integrating those who had been imprisoned but survived into everyday life. These individuals carried visible and invisible scars, emotional trauma, physical weakness, and social suspicion. Families worked to reintegrate them. Neighbors offered cautious acceptance, and community rituals were sometimes adapted to provide acknowledgement and support. These efforts were imperfect, uneven, and often painful, yet they marked an essential step in the moral and social reconstruction of the town. Healing, both personal and collective, required attention, patience, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Education became another crucial avenue for rebuilding. Clergy, educators, and concerned citizens began to discuss the lessons learned from the trials with the town's youth. Children were taught not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also the importance of skepticism, critical thinking, and moral discernment. Stories of the trials, the consequences of false accusations, and the human cost of fear-driven action were incorporated into lessons and family conversations. The goal was to cultivate a generation capable of resisting the kind of hysteria that had nearly destroyed their community. Awareness of human vulnerability to fear, envy, and manipulation became as central to education as religious instruction or practical skills, reflecting a profound shift in communal priorities. Throughout the town, acts of restitution, acknowledgement, and moral repair began to accumulate. Public apologies, letters of reconciliation, and careful rebuilding of social bonds contributed to the slow restoration of trust. Communities engaged in debates over fairness, mercy, and the responsibilities of citizenship. Moral reflection became a shared, communal exercise, influencing both private conduct and public decision-making. Even as scars persisted, emotional, social, and physical, the process of rebuilding offered a path forward, a fragile yet meaningful attempt to restore Salem to a functional, ethical, and cohesive society. By the end of Scene 9, Salem existed in a liminal space between its traumatic past and the tentative hope of moral and social restoration. The town was marked by grief, memory, and lingering suspicion, but it was also infused with reflection, remorse, and deliberate efforts at reconstruction. Families had begun to reconcile, social institutions had begun to stabilize, and the collective conscience had been awakened to the perils of fear-driven hysteria. Salem's story, etched into its streets, homes, and hearts, now carried the dual legacy of tragedy and the enduring human capacity for reflection, accountability, and moral repair. The town of Salem, still marked by grief and tentative recovery, stood as a testament to the consequences of unchecked fear. Life moved cautiously forward, with streets gradually regaining activity, children cautiously playing, and neighbors tentatively reconnecting. Yet beneath this fragile veneer of normalcy lingered an invisible weight, the memory of months dominated by suspicion, accusation, and the loss of innocent lives. Families moved carefully within their homes, aware of the fragile trust that had been fractured, while parents silently taught their children the lessons learned in the crucible of fear, that appearances could deceive, that authority could be misused, and that the line between vigilance and hysteria was dangerously thin. Every home in Salem carried traces of trauma. Mothers, who had once encouraged or silently endorsed accusations, grappled with guilt and remorse. Fathers, who had failed to shield their loved ones, wrestled with self-recrimination and the subtle consequences of fear-driven inaction. Children, whose innocence had been interrupted by the spectacle of accusation, bore a growing understanding of morality, responsibility, and the human propensity for cruelty. Conversations, once filled with casual talk, were now layered with caution, reflection, and the careful weighing of every word. Trust, once assumed, had to be rebuilt deliberately, and the town's social fabric, torn and fragile, required painstaking repair. Civic and religious institutions, too, sought to reconcile with the moral devastation of the past months. Courts reopened with a new emphasis on tangible evidence, fairness, and due process, guided by the painful lessons of spectral accusations and coerced confessions. Magistrates and clergy, many haunted by their prior roles, delivered sermons and statements that emphasized moral vigilance, humility, and the dangers of acting without clear evidence. Public acknowledgement of mistakes became a cornerstone of rebuilding trust, as communities attempted to reconcile authority with conscience and justice. These efforts, while imperfect, signaled a critical shift, that moral reflection, accountability, and ethical guidance must accompany the exercise of power. The reintegration of those who had been imprisoned required both sensitivity and patience. Survivors returned to families forever altered by absence and suspicion, navigating the difficult terrain of restored relationships and lingering fear. Daily routines, once fractured, slowly resumed. Children returned to school, guided by lessons not only in reading and arithmetic, but in the principles of critical thinking, ethical discernment, and the recognition of human vulnerability to fear and suggestion. The town's educational efforts now carried a moral dimension, teaching lessons that would inform the next generation's understanding of justice, evidence, and collective responsibility. Memorialization became another crucial element of recovery. Families and neighbors honored those who had died unjustly, sharing stories, maintaining grave sites, and creating informal remembrances. These acts of remembrance reinforced moral lessons, honored the victims, and reminded the living of the perils of fear-driven judgment. Collective memory became a tool for moral instruction, shaping the town's emerging identity as one cautious of panic, vigilant against injustice, and conscious of the ethical dimensions of authority and communal life. Social interactions began to regain a cautious equilibrium. Markets reopened, neighbors visited one another, and community gatherings resumed, though now with heightened awareness of the past. Acts of reconciliation, apologies, and mutual acknowledgement were carefully performed to restore broken trust. People approached relationships with deliberate care, understanding that fear had once been a weapon capable of disrupting the very foundations of community life. Slowly, a culture of accountability, reflection, and ethical engagement began to take shape alongside practical efforts to restore normalcy. Even as the town rebuilt, the legacy of fear remained. The executed and imprisoned could never return, and their absence created permanent voids in families, social networks, and the community psyche. Yet their memory, preserved through storytelling, records, and rituals, served as a perpetual warning. The story of the trials became embedded not only in Salem's history, but in the broader cultural consciousness, illustrating the dangers of hysteria, the importance of evidence, and the enduring need for moral vigilance. Every conversation, sermon, and lesson reminded residents that unchecked fear could easily override reason and justice, and that awareness and reflection were essential to prevent repetition of such calamity. The psychological echoes of the trials persisted in every corner of the town. Survivors bore emotional scars, often subtle but profound, influencing behavior, judgment, and social engagement. The trauma of unjust imprisonment, the loss of loved ones, and the fear that had dominated months of life left a lasting imprint. Yet within this landscape of sorrow, moral growth emerged. The community developed a heightened awareness of human susceptibility to fear and manipulation, learning to approach authority, evidence, and communal judgment with caution, empathy, and critical thought. Over time, the events of Salem transcended their local context, becoming a symbol of the perils of hysteria and the fragility of justice. The lessons learned informed neighboring towns, influencing discourse on legal standards, moral responsibility, and civic vigilance. Salem became a cautionary tale, its story woven into the collective understanding of how fear, suspicion, and unchecked authority could devastate lives and societies. The memory of what occurred was preserved through letters, records, sermons, and family narratives, ensuring that the past remained a guide for future generations, seeking to navigate the delicate balance between fear, judgment, and humanity. In reflecting upon these events, it becomes clear that the town's recovery was not simply a return to pre-hysteria life. It was the creation of a new social and moral consciousness, one that recognized both human fallibility and the potential for resilience. Families, institutions, and individuals were forever shaped by the experiences of the trials, and this shaping extended into cultural, legal, and ethical thought in the wider world. The lessons were profound. Fear, when left unchecked, could dominate reason. Accusation could become a weapon, and authority, if untempered by conscience and evidence, could inflict lasting harm. Yet through reflection, remorse, and the painstaking reconstruction of trust and justice, the town demonstrated the possibility of learning from tragedy, of cultivating moral awareness, and of rebuilding a society capable of recognizing and resisting its own vulnerabilities. Even centuries later, the story of Salem remains relevant. It serves as a mirror, reflecting the enduring human tensions between fear and reason, authority and conscience, suspicion and trust. The town's experience illustrates the necessity of vigilance, empathy, and critical judgment in the face of mass hysteria and social pressure. Salem's streets, homes, and institutions, though physically restored, carry the invisible marks of the past, ensuring that memory, reflection, and moral awareness continue to guide the community. The story of the trials persists, not as a mere historical footnote, but as a living lesson that the past, with all its terror and consequence, continues to haunt, instruct, and shape human understanding, long after the events themselves have passed from view. Salem's legacy, therefore, is both a warning and a testament. It is a warning of what occurs when fear is allowed to dictate action, when human judgment is clouded by hysteria, and when society allows suspicion to override evidence and conscience. It is a testament to the resilience of human communities, to the possibility of moral reflection, and to the power of collective learning in the aftermath of tragedy. The town's experience demonstrates that while fear and injustice can leave deep scars, they can also catalyze ethical growth, vigilance, and enduring lessons for generations to come. The town of Salem stands in quiet reflection, its streets and homes marked by the echoes of fear, loss, and grief. The faces of those who suffered linger in memory, shaping every conversation, every cautious step, and every moment of connection. Families rebuild trust with careful hands, children learn lessons of morality and reason born from pain, and communities slowly reclaim a sense of balance and order. The weight of past mistakes guides their actions, reminding all that fear, unchecked, can devastate even the closest bonds. Silence carries its own lesson, a subtle echo of the voices lost, of lives interrupted, and of innocence destroyed. Yet within that silence, a fragile hope emerges, a reminder that reflection, empathy, and vigilance can restore what has been broken. The town story is neither simple nor easy. It is a testament to human vulnerability, the consequences of suspicion, and the enduring potential for understanding and moral growth. Time moves forward, but the memory of what transpired lingers, whispering to all who listen that fear can destroy, yet reason can heal. That suspicion can divide, yet conscience can unite. That even in the darkest moments, human awareness and empathy hold the power to restore balance. The lessons endure, quietly shaping hearts and minds, a living reminder that the past continues to guide the present, and that vigilance, understanding, and compassion are the keys to preventing history from repeating itself.